Hey guys, welcome to the MC Anime Podcast. We cover anime, geek culture, Japanese aesthetics, and Asian studies. We are a multi-fandom podcast, and you can expect to hear topics in your favorite hobby or fandom activity potentially. You can find MC Anime on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Also, please check out mcanimepodcast.com, our website. Furthermore, stay tuned in for another episode.
Welcome to Japan on Film Podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and back today with a new episode and a new guest. I'd like to welcome a fellow podcaster, and that's Mason Colon. Mason, how you doing today?
Pretty good. How you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. Sorry, I got a little one screaming next to me, so let's get her. Be a little bit quiet. So, first thing I'd like to do is I'd like you to tell the people a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a podcast host. We're called MC Anime. We cover anime, geek culture, and Japanese aesthetics or / Asian studies. It's dedicated to those three areas. However, geek culture is pretty broad, so I like to expand upon that and give different clarity about different genres that apply in like niche areas. Started about October last year. It transitioned from my blog into a podcast. So MC Anime was actually my blog name before I actually did podcasting. It was a passion when I did blogging, and it was an avenue that I found to do communicating my passion on the internet, and it was fun, but it got very tiresome. Also, a little bit about me is I want to study mass communications, so podcasting is perfect for that. It combines anime and audio production together. And you can find me at Facebook, Blog MC Anime, and also you can put the social media handle at capital B LOG, capital M, capital C, capital A N I M E, Blog MC Anime. All that is a social media handle.
Okay, so how's the response been to the podcast so far? Have you gotten people listening to it and enjoying it?
Yeah, I have about like 1,000 downloads in total. It's pretty good. I have a good response from it.
Good, very cool. And how did you get interested in anime and Japanese type stuff in the first place?
Well, I think the big transition for anime for me was mostly the DC and DC and Marvel animated TV shows. I started rewatching them when I watched them as a child, and just the medium from animation started sticking more for me. And then that's why I got into Japanese animation.
Sorry, I had the little one screaming a little bit over here.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm also a big Marvel and DC guy from way back. So my other podcast is actually all about superhero movies and TV shows. So you're speaking my language right there. And was there any kind of anime that Japanese wise that was really kind of like what I like to call your gateway drug into this world?
I mean, I have vivid memories of watching Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh as a child. But gateway-wise, I don't know if it was really gateway. I just started watching it after my phase with rewatching superhero shows.
Okay, very cool. And today we're talking. And it's fitting. It's good that we have you on for today because we are talking about an anime film. One of the early Studio Ghibli films.
Yes.
And that is 1988's Grave of the Fireflies, in Japanese, Hotaru no Haka. And it's one of those animated movies that really kind of elevated the medium and compared to, and really showed people that this is more than than just stuff that's for kids. So my first exposure to it was actually fairly recently because my students had requested it for our last film of the semester, and so we ended up watching that, and that was my first exposure to it, was just like literally a few weeks ago. But how about you? What was your first exposure to this movie?
My first exposure is okay. So I watched it with some Studio Ghibli, but I think my main exposures did Asian studies. And that was studying Asian civilization. That was a history class, and one of the things we had was Grave of the Fireflies being very prominent in the war aspect, and also representing Japan during the time that we were doing it. So we had to write a film analysis. Is this historically accurate? Does the events represent what they should, and then we answer questions and stuff like that. So I have like a different perspective from that when I also first watched it as well. And that experience proved more successful than I thought it would, because it wasn't it was from a historical perspective, not a film class per se. So we were looking for the historical elements and applying that in the essay that we wrote too. So it was also a film assignment plus watching the movie.
Sorry, I'm getting some emails popping up here. I'll close that out of the way. All right. Yeah, so the history aspect is one of the things that I focus on a lot when I taught this film as well. And it's actually based, it's semi-autobiographical, or I guess semi-biographical is probably a better way to say it, because it was the short story it was based on was written by Akiyuki Nosaka, and this was inspired by his own experiences during the bombing raids and the U.S. bombing raids of Japan, and his experiences with his sister. And also the director, Isao Takahata, he was also a child during the bombings. Although he had a slightly better experience, none of his family mercifully died or anything like that. But just like the experience of being there, he brought a lot of that. One of the things in one of the interviews I read that he said was that the way most movies depict fire bombings is completely wrong. It's not like these big explosions. It's just like fire raining down. And I thought that was, I thought this movie really did a really good job of capturing that.
Yeah, I believe it did, because for me, it captured one specific. It captured the reality of what war looked like. You can get involved in the storyline, feel for the character, but also at the same time know that whatever's going to happen is historically accurate in setting. Not everything in the movie is like 400% nonfiction. But for me, I like it because it's a catalyst to what that time was. And, to me, Japan started that animation because of World War II. They did the entire early versions of the war campaign, what their experience was. And that's another movie that you can add about that's later in the line that's still in that similar genre, the war genre that came after World War II.
Yeah, I thought those aspects of it, the fact that it touches on some of the misconceptions and basically the lies that the Japanese government had told the people, was one of the aspects of the movie that was very well done. There's the fact that Seita, throughout the entire movie, he's wearing the naval cap that his father gave him. And people are telling him, oh, your father, you're a Navy boy, your father's a Navy man, you've got to be strong, you've got to, and you all this kind of stuff. And I thought having that aspect of him, and also the scene when he's reciting when he's telling Setsuko about the war rally that they had been to, or the war demonstration, and he's remembering the music, and then he's singing along with it, and he's miming the soldier moves, and then he realizes that he's just staring at the fireflies against the blanket, and he looks over and goes to sleep, and he just there's kind of like this realization in that the war has kind of taken everything from him. And that also doubly so when he finds out about the surrender, and he kind of has this moment of denial when he's like, oh, but it's the great empire of Japan, we can't be, how can we lose? And then and then he screams out, I hate you, Father, and all of that, and you really realize that he's been completely lied to his whole life. And I think it's a very powerful a moment in that film, and I think it echoes what a lot of people who were in that situation experienced at the time, especially young people, because I remember to Kinji Fukasaku, who directed Battle Royale and the Yakuza Papers series, who he had said that he had worked in a munitions factory when he was like 15 years old during the war, and it was bombed, and it wasn't until after the war that he realized that, they had been completely lied to. And I thought the movie did a really good job of kind of indicting that aspect of the war.
And also, to pay along on the fire, the significance of that moment is very surreal, because now you connect to the character, but you also get the different side of what is the reality, what is the truth, because that epiphany moment brings you in as the character. It not only drives the plot from that point, but it also supports the further point of not everything is cut and dry. You have to have a different perspective to gain the new realization that it might not be the perspective that you have, which I think is really important to achieve, because as humanity, we strive to understand the world, and not all the time is our perspective that understanding that we want. So we need new perspectives to have new understanding. And by having new understanding, we can achieve a different meaning. And that different meaning gives us a branch off into what that reality is, what those shoes are like, and provides a profile of what it could be.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very well said. And I think having that other perspective, and that's why I love movies like this that show you the perspective from the civilian side of it, because when I was born and raised in America, and when we studied World War II in school and all that, it's always presented as very one-sided, and in some ways there's some elements of truth to that, right? Japan was had a very fascistic government at the time. They were imprisoning people. They were, brutal colonizers all across Asia. All of that is true, but you look at what the people were going through, and I think movies like this really kind of shine a light on the fact that the civilians were just as much victims of the fascism as anyone else was. And I think the movie like this really helps to show that.
Oh yeah, I think it does really well with that as well. And from my perspective, I think it's proven stronger, but not because not only that, but there's other elements of like heart to heart moments that you just want to reach up to the character and be with them. It creates that moments to connect to the character even more. And with Brave of the Fireflies, I think it's very strong in that capacity to realize.
Yeah, and I feel for the characters so much in this movie, especially since becoming a father myself. Like I relate so much to what Seita's dealing with and trying to protect his sister, and just like his sister being so young, right? Setsuko's like 4 or 5 years old in this movie, and my own daughter is only 1 year old, so it's very, very similar kind of ideas. And it's, and I noticed the types of things, the way he acts with Setsuko, the way he tries to, you know, tries to hide the worst of things from her. And when you remember the fact that he's only 14, 15 years old, he's a kid himself. I mean, an adult would have trouble dealing with all this kind of pressure, and you put that on a kid, and it's hard to even imagine how strong, how much he would have gone through in that time.
Oh yeah, and he has to not only hide the truth, give it whatever meaning he wants. But I really think the Fireflies are really significant because there's different moments in the movie they each come out, but they all have a different symbolicness to them.
Yeah, so that's a good thing. Sorry, go ahead.
With the Fireflies, you have like different situations and how they present themselves. Each situation is significant because the Firefly is actually a symbol of hope or a different meaning. That light is like a different reality presented. That in that moment is really symbolic because of that.
Yeah, there's apparently an ongoing debate in the fan community about this movie, about what the Fireflies represent. I'm not sure how familiar you are with those discussions. For me, I kind of avoided them myself just because I didn't want to have my own opinion too influenced when I talk to my students about it. But the way I kind of looked at it is the line that strikes me is Setsuko's line, one of the most famous lines in the movie, when she says, "Why must fireflies die so soon?" And that, I thought that was so striking. And there's a lot of different ways you could look at it, which is probably why there's such debate in the fan community about it. But the way I kind of looked at it is it's kind of they're kind of a symbol of human life in general, and just like how fragile life is. I mean, the fact that they come out, they burn bright, they create all this beauty, but then they quickly die and they're gone, almost like that. I thought that was a very poignant metaphor for what they're going through. And because Setsuko and Seita themselves, particularly Setsuko, I think, because she's such a bright spot in the movie, she's really the Firefly. Connecting her with that, I think, is something that that was the connection I gravitated towards myself. How about you? What were some of the symbolism that you personally thought, or that you've heard of discussed before?
Well, I actually had to bring that up in the assignment when I did in the history class. I gave it meaning, like I analyzed the moment and what I thought the Firefly represented. So what I thought it represented was the moment when a different reality is pictured. And in that different reality, we actually have a glimpse of what it could be outside of what the situation is. Because the Fireflies are very glowing, very bright, and give off a very different feeling with the movie's portraying. You could go with the route that it's bright because of the fire in the background. But I think it's a different kind of brightness. It's not the fire brightness, it's the yellow. And yellow is usually a new beginning. Yellow is hopefulness. When you think of yellow, you think of the sun. The sun gives life. And when life, you have different outcomes, and those outcomes present themselves in various ways. So you can look at it as, well, the sun's giving me life. How about the fireflies? The fireflies are representative of that light. So in my case, the fireflies are the beacon for hope, just like lighthouses for the ships in the sea.
Okay, that's an interesting take on it. Yeah, that's very cool. I like that. Another thing too is the association with the kamikaze, because they're often referred to, and there have been numerous movies about kamikaze that have used some variation of Firefly in the title or in the marketing campaign or whatever. And I thought, and there's even that one scene when they're laying on the ground and they look up and they see one of the Zero fighters flying overhead, and Setsuko makes the comment that, oh, it's just like they look just like Fireflies. And I thought that was interesting because there's this, so I live here in Kagoshima. There's a kamikaze museum, and where you can go there and you can read a lot of the final messages and the final letters that the pilots wrote before they went on their missions. And it's heartbreaking to read it, because these were kids, right? They're like 17, 18, 19, 20. Like the oldest was like around 25 or so, and just all that like wasted potential and like all that. And it's just, I think that's another link too. That's another link that I made too as well, with the idea of life being so fleeting and just war just kind of snuffing out all these lives as well. And something else too is when you were talking about the rebirth, that also reminded me of the memory scene when Seita is remembering the photograph that he took with his parents, and you have the sakura, the cherry blossoms falling in the background. And I thought that was another powerful imagery, because just like very similar to the Fireflies, right? The sakura are very beautiful. They're also symbols of rebirth, of life, but they also die so quickly, right? And
they're
I
only
think
available in the spring. When the summer hits, they like go out to be the leaves and all that stuff.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So I thought
the
that
season's so limited.
Yeah, and I thought that was another interesting aspect of it, is incorporating the cherry blossoms into that scene, because that, and I think, and Seita doesn't realize it at the time, right? Because he's being a kid, he's making funny faces at the camera and all that kind of stuff. But looking back on it now, he realizes just how fleeting that moment was, and how that was like the last chance that his family had to be a family, really.
Yeah, and I think it's very strong of that fact, because when they were family, they were together.
Mm-hmm.
When the war happened, they were all separated. No one was together anymore. So the war took on a new persona of taking people away from loved ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For the war effort. During this time, you didn't have everyone, because everyone was either in war in the campaign, or covering the war, or doing something related to the industry. Like even the entire industries that do cars were dedicated to the war effort. Everyone was shifted from normal life to prepare for war. And I think with Imperial Japan during this time, the belief of nationalism and the overall global worldview presented them an opportunity, which is controversial, but gave them the headway to justify them as basically the best nation in Asia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Domination of that, and that culture is what we see.
Yeah, that's very well said. And something else too, I want to talk about his aunt a little bit, because I think the aunt's an interesting character in this movie. Yeah, and because she, and I think she really illustrates that Japanese concept of honne tatemae, right? The whole idea of like there's this the whole idea of the two faces, right? There's the public face and there's the private face. And when she welcomes them into her house. When she's talking to other people, they're like, oh, it's so good of you to take in these orphans and all this kind of stuff. But then as time goes on, and she starts criticizing them when nobody else is looking, right? She's saying, oh, you're not working, you're lazy, and even the fact that she steals their rice, like she takes that rice from them, and Setsuko even mentions, but wasn't that our rice to begin with? And I thought that was
Yeah.
That was interesting, and I thought it was very representative of the Japanese society. It reminded me of a similar scene in Letters from Iwo Jima when the baker. I'm not sure if you've ever seen it, but the baker character, it's really good. It's a wonderful movie, heartbreaking, but really worth a watch. But there's this one scene when one of the characters, we see how he was drafted into the Imperial Army, and two of the women from like the city community or the city council or whatever, they come over to tell him with the soldier, and his wife protests, and his wife says, no, but you don't understand, like, we're about to have a baby, he's all I have. And the old women in the council, they kind of freak out a little bit, and they're just like, you know what, we've all had to do this, and there's this brief moment where like the cover drops from their eyes, and it's this idea of all this social pressure on having to contribute to the war effort, even on the weakest and most vulnerable of us. I thought that was a really good representation in the aunt's character.
Yeah, and also the fanatical nature of it as well. Because when you think of the aunt's perspective, she's taking them in, but she wants them to work. And the sister crying and Seto trying his best but not achieving what she wants really achieves that nature of, well, why are you here if you don't help me? I'm helping you, so please help me, because you need to earn your keep. Even in times of war, there's certain things you need to do in order to be ahead. And because those little things is, if you don't have the routine, then the war is just going to take over. So I think the art is like reminiscent of the fact that there is war. We need to do these daily activities to keep up and actually not get behind, because if we get behind, then we just have the war. We're not actually in a moment of stimulated peace, I should say.
Yeah, that's a good point too. I hadn't considered that, the fact that it's a way of maintaining routines, but that is a really interesting point. Also, the farmer too, I thought that was another interesting twist on him, because you really see how basically all these adults in their lives fail them, and I think that's a very powerful connection to the how the government had, because that was, again, taking it back to Fukasaku, that was something he had believed. He's like, adults had failed us, and I think that message is kind of, and I think that's why you see so many of these World War II era movies with when they're focused on the civilians, they focus on the young people. I think that's a very big reason for it. There's another thing that really kind of stuck out to me, and that's when, after Setsuko dies, and he's getting ready to cremate her, and there's this shot when the family comes home, and they're right across the river from where Setsuko and Seita were staying. And they're like, oh, it's so nice, the home's here, everything's okay. And they go up and they play the gramophone, and they play that music. The song is Home Sweet Home, they play, and it's right across the stream. And she talks, and the girl talks about it. It's like, oh, I've missed this beautiful view. And I think that the class implications there were very powerful for me. The whole idea of the rich and the powerful, they got to escape the worst of it, whereas it was the regular people. It's and that's true of war in any generation, in any country. It's the people who are the most affected by it, the people who lose the most, are the people who have the least.
Yeah, and that has been present throughout different times, because the people that have the poor nature, when they lose it, they can't necessarily gain it as someone who has the wealth to regain it. The wealth disparity across centuries has been a main problem anyway. And Japan's been one of those wealth disparity metaphors because it's always a recurring thing because the Japanese society, not everyone has all the money. Until now, after the transition of World War II, it became a democracy. So big business became a way to get more money. But traditionally, big money wasn't really, it was more into the royalty or the shogun, people of higher up in society that were determined by status, and that set of economic prosperity as well.
Yeah, and it also reminded me of, because before I taught this movie, a movie that we had watched fairly recently in my class was The Emperor in August, which is about the emperor's decision to surrender at the end of the war. And the thing that struck me is watching those two movies back to back is seeing in Emperor in August, and it's very much similar to that scene with the family coming back, is that they're talking about these attacks in Tokyo and everything, but all throughout the movie, the prime minister, the cabinet officials, all of them, they're sitting nice and comfy in big mansions and all that. And it's such a contrast to this movie, and Seita and Setsuko's home. It's leveled, it's gone, and they're having to live in this cave on the beach. And I thought that contrast was very powerful, especially when you also compare it with the scene that opens the movie, which I thought was a really interesting choice. Was Takahata opens this movie with Seita dying, and the way everybody treats him in that opening scene, and they're just kind of like, oh, another one. We got to clean these bodies out of here before the the occupation troops arrive and all that. And the idea of the can spilling open and just like his ghost coming free because of that. And what struck me is looking at the rest of the station there, all the other people who were in a similar situation as Seita. And it makes you wonder how many of those people had a similar story that was just as heartbreaking. And we don't think about that. And it goes back to that old quote, which often attributed to Stalin, although there's no proof he'd actually said it, but of one man's death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. And I think that's one of the dangers when we talk about war, is when we talk about casualties, is we don't think about what the cost of that casualty is.
Yeah, because when you hit the historical perspective, the one fact is the casualties. They say that they're part of this death. This is the casualties of war. Historically, when they look at that, they see, okay, this is the devastation that the war caused. But that's just a devastation on numbers. The devastation is more specifically in the testimony of the people affected, like the survivors are the witnesses to after war-like events, the acceptance of reality when the war ends, when they have lost their family. They are the most significant evidence because they directly experience what happened. And it's not just something in a encyclopedia or a history class that can examine one piece and examine it in a historical perspective. But then once you do the first primary documentation, you learn a lot more because there's so many other sides that you never considered because you've only been presented the history aspect of it, which I think is more striking because that carries weight. Their testimony is worth something. It has personal evidence to them. It's connecting to them to what happened, and it connects us through them through their perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with that. I think the personal testimonies are so important because of everything you just said, and having that, seeing what these stories are like, seeing what these people have gone through. I mean, it's something that I don't think there's enough focus on. I think far too often a lot of people get caught up in when looking back on wars of the past, there's too much emphasis on military accomplishments or weapons or anything like that, and not enough focus on what the casualties are, unless you're trying to paint the other side, right? There's obviously from the American perspective, talking about all the atrocities that Japan had done, Unit 731 or the Bataan Death March, or talking about the Nazis and the Holocaust and on and on and on. But there's not as much weight given to the atrocities that the Allies caused, because I remember when as one example, when I was in elementary school and we first learned about the internment, I called them. I said to my teacher, I called them concentration camps, and she corrected me. She's like, no, they weren't we didn't do concentration camps. The Nazis did concentration camps. We did internment camps. And growing up, and as you go back and you research the history of concentration camps, you actually realize that no, the term was accurate. It's become associated with the death camps as well, and Americans wanted to put that buffer zone between what was reality.
I feel like the concentration camps or internment camps that we had because I'm American, I think that what we had was, a policy saying, oh yeah, we will protect the POWs. That's fine. But we also, at one point in the war effort, suspected just regular citizens of Asian descent,
right,
Japanese and all that stuff, as potential traitors. So we put them in a not necessarily a concentration camp, but an entire community just for them to live out their lives, because they can't prove themselves not to be war enemies. So as a preventive nature, we just put them into this living situation that's not as ideal, and they're just living all together because they're forced to do
it. I'd still argue that it meets the definition of concentration camps, because especially when they
suspected them of treason, when in reality,
right,
they were just wanting to support the war effort just as much as the American people did.
Right. There was an old saying in the pre-war days that if you wanted to make a Nisei, second generation Japanese immigrants, if you wanted to make them truly American, have them spend some time in Japan, have them visit relatives in Japan, and then they'd come back and they'd want to stay in America. And like the Nisei, the Sansei especially, they were had much stronger connections to America than they did to Japan. But just the fact because of their family history, because they looked different, there was suspicion placed upon them. It was, and not only that, but their families had everything stolen from them, basically by the governments. And so, but that's one example of atrocities that the Americans committed against. Or you look also at the nuclear bombings, the fire bombings of these cities, the deliberate targeting of civilian areas for to try to hasten the end of the war. I mean, those are things that aren't really talked about as often, and I think it's important when you're talking about war is to look at both of those sides of it, and look at the Japanese were bad, but the Americans were not necessarily 100% heroes either.
No, I don't think that at all. I think with the when you take a look historically back on the America's attempt to isolate Asian descent and Japanese, well, they like 10 to 15 years later recognized that as a liability, so they did a restitution of sorts. So they gave back money to the families or in the ordeal of that atrocities that they did. And with the justification to end a war with 2 nuclear bombs, and it's just a testing of those bombs because they hadn't actually previously used them in action, is sentiment to the will of the Japanese people not to give up. And once they had that hope taken away from them, they had to take so much loss of life for them to surrender.
Well, that was a common belief at the time, although the even contemporaneously, Japanese experts disputed that, and they had warned Truman that that's not the case. The people here are actually very anxious to see the war end, and there was a lot of the people who would push that narrative were actually the people who knew the least about Japanese society.
That should not have happened, but it
right.
did.
Right. I'm just saying the reasons
they immediately surrendered and did, because like you showed Iron Fist, yeah, good, but like what does that give us? It doesn't give us anything.
Mm-hmm.
It just makes the death toll even more than what the war did.
Yeah, and it especially because it was just it was wholly unnecessary. It was, especially I think there are some, you could possibly make an argument for the first nuclear bomb, although I still think that was a mistake too. But I think when you're talking about Nagasaki, I think then you're getting into war crimes territory at that point, because there was absolutely no need for the second bomb. And at that point, it just seemed there's also an element of, I think also the dehumanization of the Japanese played into that as well in American propaganda. And there's this idea that all the Japanese would rise up and fight against the Americans, when not really. I mean, and a lot of people did the accounts of civilians committing suicide because the Americans were coming in were overstated and far less common than was what was thought.
I mean, yeah, we built up a democracy in Japan, but like, does that really be amends for what we did in the two bombings?
No, definitely not.
So.
Yeah,
it doesn't even compare, because that's thousands of years of retribution to even get any remotely close to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another thing too is, one of the interesting aspects of this movie is that it's often defined as an anti-war film, but one of the interesting things is that Takahata always insisted that it's not an anti-war film.
Anti-war film. I think it's a depiction of what is. I don't think it's anti-war. I don't think it's like telling that war should not happen. It's presenting the real life of what war is. And I think it does it really well in that telling of that story, depicting the situation, what war life is.
Yeah,
because without it, we don't have the comparison of what is the experience, how does it play out, and how does it affect other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had asked this question to my students, and there's definitely a mixed response. Like, I think about half the class thought it was an anti-war film, half the class thought it wasn't an anti-war film. Here's what Takahata actually said in an interview, which I thought was pretty interesting. He said, "Japan was devastated by the war. We should never forget that, just as we should never forget that we also inflicted a lot of suffering on other countries. However, nobody knows how horrifying a war is going to be at the beginning of hostilities. Grave of the Fireflies isn't an anti-war film simply because it cannot prevent another war from happening."
Yeah. And, just because, well, the power of that statement is saying that it's a depiction of war, but war is going to happen regardless if it's in a movie form, book, or real life. It's going to happen because human differences, resources, money, wealth, control over a certain domain, all that influences culturally, hostility, all that influences what causes the war. And those causes often have a buildup of aggression, and then that match to the gasoline ignites a wildfire that is just can't be stopped, can't be unleashed. You can't prevent it, so you do the action, and then it happens. You can't go back from it.
Yeah, and I think something you had said in there, and something that Takahata had said, I think really makes an interesting point, because one of Takahata's regrets about this movie is that he felt that because this is just a depiction of what happens to people in war, he actually expressed some worry that the film could actually be used to justify military aggression, military buildup, because the attitude being like, oh well, look, if we had more weapons, if we were better prepared, if we had stronger defenses, we could have prevented all of this from happening. And I think I thought that was a really, because when I first saw this movie, my first thought was, oh yeah, it's obviously anti-war. But reading what Takahata said after the fact, it really made me kind of question that and thinking, maybe there's, it makes a good point, right? Because these types of, especially in, dealing with the potential remilitarization of Japan, which has been discussed in recent years, is the idea that one of the things that the Japanese right wing in particular loves to do is paint Japan as a victim, and
I think
use
victim and aggressive.
I think so. Yeah, I think exactly. It's much more nuanced. I agree. They do. There is this but one of the things that the right wing does try to do here is they try to paint Japan as 100% a victim, and that's been used as an argument to kind of justify the potential repeal of Article 9 and things of that nature. And I think the fact that I think Takahata's kind of one regret about the movie is that it doesn't go far enough in condemning war, I think is an interesting perspective that he had on that.
Yeah. I mean, it's really hard to make a movie that is presenting war and demeaning the meaning of war, because usually you can only go like one way with it.
Yeah.
If you go both ways, you can lose the narrative. So in the narrative that he present was real life war conditions, which probably did better than an anti-war message, in my opinion, because once you start, now there is ways to present war life conditions and then have a transition in the movie as an anti-war message. That can be certainly done, but that is not particularly strong, because it has the core element like dedicated to another story. But you have to do it in a way that's convincing.
Right. Yeah. It would have been a tall order, I think, to really kind of work an anti-war message into this. I think that's a good point. I did think it was interesting that Takahata kind of had that perspective on the movie, though, looking back on it, because the movie it can be read those two different ways. One other thing that I thought was really interesting, and the last shot when Seita and Setsuko's ghosts are sitting together on the bench, and the camera pans up and you see it's modern Japan in the background, and I thought that was such a powerful image. What did you think was the symbolism of that? How did that strike you?
Oh, what's it again?
The final shot when they're sitting in the bench and the camera pans up and you see that the hill that they're sitting on, the hill that's overlooking the city, it's not the Japan that they died in, it's modern Japan in the background.
I mean, I think that is a scope to after the warlike conditions, the recovery effort, and the ability to try to have a normalcy after the war is symbolic. Because it's now the progression of life after war. It took less time to rebuild than the time it took to take that many lives. So the regression aspect afterwards is just, to me, too fast. Because the loss of life took so many years.
Okay. Yeah, my reading of that scene is I thought it was really powerful for me because I took it to mean that it's almost like a cautionary tale, the fact that we that these stories are often forgotten, and I think that the ghosts are still, still
Yeah.
exist, and those ghosts still exist in modern Japan. And if we don't acknowledge those ghosts that exist, if we don't acknowledge the suffering that people went through, right? The old Adam that uh, people who forget the past are doomed to repeat it.
Oh yeah, it's a teaching lesson for
Mhm.
sure because you have to look at history through historical events to take into account what could happen in the future.
Right,
And there's
right.
some preventive nature if society looked at that as a preventive nature. Just imagine, okay, this situation happened, so let's make this a thing and fix this.
Hmm.
Imagine how precautious society would be. And actually, that's another problem because if you become too precaution, then you basically don't have the freedom to do this because this has to be prevented at all costs.
Right.
So you have to take it as you can't be too precaution, but you have to take in consideration what is the causes. So if you take the main causes and the acts of aggression up to it, one thing that will never is appeasement.
Hmm.
Appeasement is going to always lead to more war, and it took another war of appeasement to let that happen.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it was two wars, both because they don't notice what's happening, and then it's too late.
Hmm.
Both great wars are like that,
Yeah. Absolutely.
especially the second Great War too.
Well, especially I mean, you look at what's happening now, current global situations, what's
It's
happening with
yeah,
Russia and Ukraine, and the implications that has for China and Taiwan, or Hong Kong, and
uh-huh.
all these. Yeah, it's yeah. I think I agree. The appeasement side of things is definitely a very slippery slope.
Yeah,
Um, that was pretty much most of the things that kind of
yeah.
jumped out at me about this movie. Was there anything else we haven't mentioned that kind of jumped out at you? Anything you wanted to focus on?
I think they're bringing up of the sister
Hmm.
and continually caring with her when there was really no one else. And she will have like all these outbursts because she didn't understand the situation.
Hmm.
So her emotional uh, outbursts are signs of the real life condition happening. She's not able to understand what's going on. Not only that, her brother has to take care of her, provide the safety net that a father might present,
Hmm.
and the absence of such father, and also bind together to get resources for food, which end up stealing from the farmer, and the farmer finds out about it. And the farmer's reaction to that is detrimental to them because they're basically cascading like you should not steal. We don't have enough food.
Hmm.
And his reaction is more relevant in that because now what they're going to do for food, they don't have this resource they were kept using from the vice, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he plays an interesting role because he's trying to grow the food and he doesn't have much of it, so they're stealing it and he's furious.
Hmm. That's also a really good, I think, statement, because he makes mention of the fact that it's for the war effort,
Yeah,
and that's another aspect I think about this movie. That's one of the subtler aspects, which is, I think, um, if they were probably more pronounced, then I think you make a stronger argument for it being an anti-war film. But the fact
yeah.
that towards the end of the war, especially the the imperial army, the imperial military, was basically bleeding the country dry. Like at
Yeah.
the end of the war, there was like nothing happening in Japan that was not devoted to the war effort.
Hmm. And
And
it took, yeah, the national policy was to provide as much as possible when in reality they didn't really have much gain because they were losing.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And okay. The yeah, all that's really interesting. I think what you mentioned too about Setsuko and just like being unable to really comprehend everything that was
Yeah.
happening. That was something that also jumped out at me. It's something that I was paying really close attention to. Um, and one of the scene when she reveals that she knows that their mother is dead, I thought
Yeah.
was that was a really powerful moment, especially when Seta breaks down like that, because
Hmm.
um not only, I mean, there's so many ways to read that scene. One way is obviously that, he's sad because she had to find this out without his help, without him being there for her. But also another way I read it too is because it reminded me when my own father passed away, and just the delay and the kind of denial, and not allowing yourself to feel that until you can't hold it back anymore. I think there was definitely an aspect to that in what Seta was going through in that moment.
Oh yeah, I think it's especially strong because those I we really have barely any glimpses of the father. We only have him in flashbacks, and I think didn't he pass away? I don't think he came back.
It's never confirmed one way or the other, but they'd said when Seta finds out about the war, he asks, what about the Navy? What about all the ships? And the guy says, oh, there's not a single ship left. They were all sunk. So he kind of, and the fact that they hadn't heard anything, they hadn't gotten any letters from the father. There's kind of, Seta kind of like accepts that his father is gone.
Yeah.
So even though we don't, and I think that's another aspect too of the movie, that there were so many people that didn't know if their fathers or their sons or their brothers or their husbands were even still alive at the end there.
Yeah.
Because just so much of the communication had just broken down by that point.
Oh
yeah. Okay, Mason, any other things you wanted to mention about Grave of the Fireflies?
I don't know. We covered most of the topics. I think one such detail we needed still is like the continuation of what is expected for nationhood, nationality, respecting your nation. Is there a way? Is there a point you stop, or is there a point you just keep going and expect the best?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. It's hard to answer. I mean, since leaving America and since living in Japan, I've definitely moved further away from national types of pride and that kind of stuff. But it is interesting because I do talk about, that's one of the themes I touch about in a lot of my classes, not so much with this movie, but with other movies I've talked about with my students, and about that idea of, at what point does patriotism turned into blind nationalism? And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, and people should watch themselves on. All right, Mason, I know you mentioned it earlier at the beginning of the show, but say it again and remind people where they can find you and your show and all that fun stuff.
They can find me at Facebook, Blog MC Anime. That's the official page I have right at the moment. That page has all my LinkedIn accounts, all my social media on the Linktree. That's Linktree MC Anime. You can also, that's another search you can do. And then at Blog MC Anime, you can just use that as a social media handle. Capital B L O G, capital M, capital C, capital A M N I M E. It's all singles, no spaces in between. So, and we do daily episodes, and thank you for having me.
Daily episodes, my God, that's
well, we do about 4 a week, give or take 3 to 4.
Okay, that's my hat's off to you, man. That's daily episodes. That's got to be that's a grind.
I did that in with blogging.
Oh, I
So
see. I see. Okay.
Yeah, so I used to do daily posts, and it just got too much. So
Yeah,
I stepped back and tried to do like 2 or 3 a week. I think that platform, that model worked for me, so it works out better because I don't have someone designing cover arts for me every single day. So
hmm
I have to give them enough time to design it because maybe it can take 2 days to design it.
hmm Okay. All right. Well, yeah. Thanks again for coming on the show. It was nice talking about Grave of the Fireflies and getting some different ideas about it. So thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so that does it for this episode of Japan on Film. As always, go to japanonfilm.com if you're interested in being on the show, or if you just want to leave some comments about it. And please make sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts. If you're watching this on YouTube, please make sure to like and subscribe. And that does it for this episode. Also, Japan on Film on Twitter and Instagram. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks so much for listening.
This concludes another episode of MC Anime Podcast. MC Anime Podcast is available on podcast directories like Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. We also have our website at mcanimepodcast.com. If you want to directly support us, then follow Patreon blog MC Anime. Finally, if you want services for hire, then we're available on Fiverr for audio and video production, graphic design, idea consulting, and blog and article writing.